From the outside, the moment looks frozen in history. A smiling president, a bright afternoon, a crowd gathered in hope, not fear. John Fitzgerald Kennedy did not rise to power quietly. He emerged at a time when the United States was redefining itself. Youth, confidence, and public optimism were part of his appeal. So were controversy, resistance, and pressure. This case is not only about a tragic death, it is about leadership, exposure, and the psychology of public trust. It teaches us how national trauma begins long before the moment everyone remembers. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born into expectation. His family did not simply encourage ambition, they demanded it. Politics, public service, and competition were part of daily life. From a psychological perspective, this environment shapes risk tolerance. Children raised under constant expectation often develop resilience. They also develop a belief that pressure is normal. Kennedy carried that belief into adulthood. By the time he reached the White House, he was the youngest elected president in American history. That fact mattered more than it seemed. Youth created hope, but it also created scrutiny. Every decision was examined through a generational lens. The early 1960s were not calm years. They were tense, fragile, and unpredictable. Cold War anxiety shaped daily life. Nuclear conflict felt possible, not theoretical. Kennedy governed under constant external threat: the Soviet Union, Cuba, Berlin. Each crisis added psychological weight. Experts in leadership psychology note a pattern here. Leaders under prolonged global stress often prioritize symbolism. Visibility becomes reassurance. Public presence becomes strategy. Kennedy understood this instinctively. He believed access mattered. He believed Americans needed to see their president. That belief influenced how he traveled. Open motorcades were not accidents. They were intentional. They projected confidence and connection. They also reduced physical barriers. At the time, security culture was very different. Presidential protection focused on proximity, not distance. Threat modeling was limited. Risk assessment relied heavily on precedent, and precedent suggested optimism. Dallas, Texas in 1963 was politically complex. Support existed, but so did hostility. Federal authority was not universally welcomed. Tensions around civil rights were rising. This matters psychologically. Public environments are shaped by emotional undercurrents. Crowds can contain admiration and resentment simultaneously. That duality often goes unnoticed. Kennedy arrived in Texas to unify. The trip was political. It was strategic. It was meant to strengthen party alignment ahead of the next election. Nothing about the schedule seemed unusual. Nothing about the day suggested danger. That normalcy is important. Human brains rely on patterns. When patterns feel familiar, vigilance decreases. This is known as normalization bias. It plays a role in many historical tragedies. Kennedy's daily routine reflected confidence. Public events, handshakes, smiles, exposure. He was accustomed to crowds. He thrived on energy. Colleagues often described him as calm under pressure. But calm does not equal invulnerability. From an educational standpoint, this case illustrates a critical lesson. Risk is often misjudged when success becomes routine. The absence of prior incidents creates false security. Security professionals later studied this moment closely. They identified a convergence of factors: open access, dense crowds, limited perimeter control. None of these elements seemed alarming in isolation. Together, they formed vulnerability. What makes this story endure is not only what happened later, it is how ordinary everything felt beforehand. That ordinariness is unsettling. History often highlights outcomes. Psychology focuses on conditions, and the conditions surrounding this case were quietly dangerous. Kennedy was not unaware of opposition. He had received criticism before. He had faced hostility during earlier visits. But human beings adapt. Repeated exposure dulls perceived threat. This is another well-documented cognitive effect. The morning of November 22nd began routinely. Briefings, travel preparations, public appearances planned to the minute. From the outside, it was a day like many others. From the inside, it carried invisible weight. This is where perspective matters. We often search for dramatic warnings, clear signs, obvious danger, but real warning signs are usually subtle. They appear as assumptions, as habits, as confidence built over time. This case would later become a reference point for executive protection worldwide, but at the time, it was simply another trip, another crowd, another city, and that is precisely why it still resonates. As the motorcade route was finalized, few questioned the approach. Open streets meant visibility, visibility meant reassurance, reassurance meant political strength. But what happens when reassurance replaces caution? That question sits at the heart of this story. It is not about hindsight judgment. It is about understanding how risk develops quietly. Because before the moment the world remembers, there was a long chain of ordinary decisions. Each one made sense at the time. Each one felt reasonable. And together they set the stage. What nobody knew then was how deeply this day would fracture public trust. Not immediately, but slowly, over decades. And that fracture began long before the first sound echoed through Dealey Plaza. The morning unfolded without urgency. Clear skies, warm air, crowds already gathering along the planned route. In Dallas, anticipation built steadily. People lined the streets hours in advance. Families brought children, cameras were ready. From a psychological perspective, crowds amplify emotion. Excitement spreads faster than caution. Where many people expect celebration, vigilance drops collectively. This dynamic matters more than most realize. The presidential schedule followed a familiar rhythm. Arrival, brief remarks. Then the motorcade. The vehicle choice reflected the era. An open limousine, minimal barriers, maximum visibility, security focused on proximity. Agents stayed close. They scanned faces, not rooftops. This approach had worked before. As the motorcade began moving through downtown Dallas, reactions were positive. Waves, smiles, cheers echoing between buildings. Nothing felt wrong. Witnesses later described the atmosphere as relaxed, almost festive. The president appeared at ease. So did the people around him. This is an important psychological detail. When leaders appear calm, observers mirror that calm. Collective reassurance lowers perceived threat across an entire environment. As the motorcade turned onto Elm Street, the pace slowed. That was intentional. Slower speed allowed better visibility. It encouraged engagement. At that moment, routine became vulnerability. Around early afternoon, as the vehicle passed through Dealey Plaza, witnesses reported hearing sharp noises. Some described them as echoes. Others struggled to identify the source. This is where human perception fractures. Under sudden stress, the brain prioritizes survival, not accuracy. Memory encoding becomes unreliable. Some people believed they heard 3 sounds. Others recalled 2. A few thought the first noise came from the street. These discrepancies are not unusual. They are expected in high-stress public incidents. Investigators study this phenomenon extensively. What is consistent is the confusion that followed. People froze, then scattered, then tried to understand what had just occurred. The motorcade accelerated. Security response shifted instantly, from public engagement to emergency containment. Within moments, the nation's leadership structure was in crisis. Information moved faster than verification. Rumors filled the gaps. Kennedy was transported for emergency medical care. Despite rapid response, he later lost his life. The transition from public appearance to national tragedy happened in minutes. For those present, time distorted. Some said it felt instantaneous. Others described it as unbearably slow. This distortion is another known psychological effect. Traumatic events alter temporal perception. Details blur. Sequences collapse. Law enforcement immediately secured the area. Witnesses were questioned. Descriptions conflicted. From an investigative standpoint, this was a nightmare scenario. A dense crowd. Multiple sound reflections. Emotional shock affecting recall. Yet action continued. Less than an hour later, a suspect was taken into custody. Lee Harvey Oswald was detained inside a nearby theater. The arrest followed reports of a separate violent encounter involving a police officer. Officers entering the theater acted on urgency, not certainty. They were responding to fragmented information. That distinction matters. Oswald resisted briefly before being restrained. He denied responsibility repeatedly. He claimed he had been framed. From a legal perspective, this moment was critical. A full trial would normally establish facts, but that process never occurred. 2 days later, while in police custody, Oswald lost his life after being shot by Jack Ruby. The second violent act intensified public shock. It also permanently altered the investigation. Without a trial, questions multiplied. Certainty became impossible. Official conclusions would face immediate skepticism. This sequence of events created what psychologists call narrative instability. When stories lack resolution, the human mind fills gaps, often with speculation. The day in Dallas ended, but its psychological impact did not. It expanded, it echoed, it entrenched itself in national memory. What investigators faced next was unprecedented. Not just a crime scene, but a public desperate for answers. And the absence of closure ensured one thing: this case would never truly end. Investigators were under pressure unlike anything seen before. Not just to solve a case, but to stabilize a nation. Within hours, federal agencies became involved. Local law enforcement worked alongside national authorities. Every action was scrutinized, every delay questioned. From an investigative psychology standpoint, this environment is dangerous. Speed competes with accuracy. Public reassurance competes with procedural caution. Evidence collection began immediately. The area around Dealey Plaza was examined. Witness statements were gathered at scale. Many contradicted one another. This was not incompetence. It was human limitation. When hundreds of people experience the same moment differently, reconstruction becomes complex. Memory is not a recording. It is interpretation. Stress reshapes perception. Investigators focused on timelines, where people were positioned, what they believed they heard, what they believed they saw. Ballistic analysis became central. So did building access points. Lines of sight were reconstructed repeatedly. Experts later emphasized a key issue: the scene was released too quickly. This reduced the opportunity for extended forensic review. At the time, however, urgency dominated. The country needed answers. Leadership needed continuity. Delay felt unacceptable. Lee Harvey Oswald quickly became the focal point. His background was examined in detail: military service, defection to the Soviet Union, political beliefs. To the public, these details felt ominous. To psychologists, they were incomplete. Ideology alone does not explain action. Oswald maintained his innocence. He denied responsibility. He insisted he was being used. Then the investigation lost its central figure. With Oswald's death, the legal process collapsed. There would be no courtroom examination, no cross-examination, no verdict tested by defense. This absence changed everything. From a systems perspective, trials serve a psychological function. They provide narrative structure, they create closure. Without them, uncertainty grows. To address this void, a formal inquiry was established. The Warren Commission was tasked with reconstructing events. Its mandate was broad, its timeline limited. The commission reviewed testimony, analyzed evidence, consulted experts. After months of work, it concluded that Oswald acted alone. The report was extensive, detailed, and immediately controversial. Critics argued key questions remained unanswered. Others believed conclusions were predetermined. Trust fractured further. This reaction follows a known pattern. When authority delivers certainty without transparency, skepticism rises, especially after trauma. Alternative theories gained traction. Multiple sound sources, different angles, hidden participants. Audio recordings were reanalyzed decades later. Some experts believed they suggested additional activity. Others strongly disagreed. This disagreement is important. Science does not always produce consensus, especially when data quality is limited. Another layer emerged: conspiracy thinking. Psychologists studying this case identified a key driver. The scale of the outcome demanded a scale of cause. A lone individual felt insufficient to many people. This is called proportionality bias. We expect big events to have big explanations. Simple answers feel wrong. Over time, theories multiplied. Intelligence agencies, foreign governments, organized crime. Each theory reflected cultural fears of its era. Cold War anxiety, institutional mistrust, political disillusionment. One claim suggested identity replacement, that Oswald was not who records indicated. This was later disproven through forensic confirmation. Yet the belief persisted. Facts do not always dissolve suspicion. Emotion often overrides evidence. From an educational standpoint, this case demonstrates how investigations can become symbolic. They stop being about facts alone. They become vessels for broader fear. Investigators faced an impossible task: prove a negative, convince a grieving public, close a story without a trial. The more they asserted certainty, the more doubt hardened. And so the investigation reached an official end. But psychologically, it never concluded, because unanswered questions do not fade, they echo. And those echoes shaped everything that followed. The truth, in this case, depends on what we mean by truth: legal truth, psychological truth, cultural truth. Legally, the conclusion was clear. Lee Harvey Oswald was identified as solely responsible. The official record closed. But for the public, closure never arrived. This gap between conclusion and acceptance is critical. When institutions resolve events faster than society can process them, mistrust forms. That mistrust does not disappear. it compounds. In the years that followed, the assassination reshaped American consciousness. Faith in authority weakened, skepticism became normalized. Questioning power felt justified. Psychologists describe this as a trust rupture. Once broken, trust rarely returns to its original state. It changes how future events are interpreted. The assassination marked a turning point. Before it, institutions were often assumed competent. After it, they were scrutinized. This shift influenced media, politics, and public discourse. Investigative journalism expanded. Government secrecy became suspect by default. Kennedy himself became symbolic, not only of leadership, but of lost optimism, a future interrupted. That symbolism matters. People grieve ideas as much as individuals. In this case, the idea was national confidence. Why do theories persist decades later? Because uncertainty invites participation. Each new generation re-examines the case through its own fears. This is not about ignorance. It is about meaning-making. Conspiracy beliefs often provide emotional structure. They offer villains, they offer coherence, they offer a sense of control. Experts emphasize an important distinction. Unanswered questions do not automatically imply hidden truths. Sometimes they reflect human limitation. Evidence degrades, memories fade, context is lost. The Kennedy case illustrates this perfectly. A massive event, limited data, extraordinary pressure. From a prevention perspective, this case transformed security practices. Motorcade protocols changed, perimeter control expanded, risk assessment evolved. These changes saved lives later. That is part of Kennedy's legacy. Another lesson is psychological. Transparency matters, not just in facts but in process. When people understand how conclusions are reached, acceptance increases. When they do not, doubt fills the space. Kennedy's family endured private grief under public scrutiny. The nation mourned collectively, but healing followed different timelines. For some, the case represents injustice. For others, tragedy without resolution. For many, both. The individual at the center became history, the questions became culture, and perhaps that is the final truth. This case is not only about what happened, it is about how societies respond when certainty collapses. We seek answers not only to know, but to feel safe again. Some mysteries fade with time, others become mirrors. This one reflects our relationship with power, trust, and uncertainty. And that is why it endures, not because the past refuses to rest, but because the questions still feel relevant, and in that sense, the story never truly ends.